So the Los Angeles Clippers just lost their 4th game in a row after acquiring James Harden, and while the first 3 games could have been excused, losing to the previously 1-win Memphis Grizzlies, now a 2-win Memphis Grizzlies team, it's pretty disgraceful, and it looks especially bad considering how awful James Harden was in this game in particular. Let's talk about it. Real quick before I get into this video, if you end up enjoying it, please be sure to subscribe. Also drop a like, it only takes 1 second. It makes a massive difference how this video performs in the YouTube algorithm. The Clippers just narrowly lost a game to the Memphis Grizzlies, a team that has been the worst team in the NBA to this point due to the suspension of Ja Morant as well as various injuries. So them losing this game looks especially bad, especially considering beforehand they looked really, really rough. Now, obviously, we're talking about a 4-game sample size, so everyone is going to say, well, it's early, and that is entirely fair. However, just because things are early does not mean that there are not very many clear and significant signs here that this roster maybe ain't it. I'm not going to say definitively that James Harden will not work out on the Clippers, but what I am saying in this video is holy shit, do things look bad. First thing I want to say is that for James Harden specifically, I didn't notice as much being his fault individually in the first 3 games here. However, he was very much the reason why they lost versus the Memphis Grizzlies, and the plus minus for this game will tell you that. Out of all of the Clippers starters, James Harden had easily the worst plus minus, being -28 on the game. He was the worst out of everyone who played. Next worst was Kawhi, so, you know, plus minus isn't everything, but the moment that James Harden would sit, you would see the Clippers go on a run. And as soon as James Harden would get back in the game, suddenly all of the momentum was back in favor of Memphis. Now, why is that? Well, the main thing that I really noticed the difference with the Clippers with Harden versus not in this game is pace as well as ball movement. James Harden kind of dictates both of those to a significant degree when he is on the floor. Given how much he dribbles the ball and given how much he dictates this team's playmaking, he kind of determines everything. He has not been great at scoring the ball and getting separation and getting opportunities to create for his teammates all that much, and subsequently the entire team is not really generating good opportunities because the system that Harden supposedly isn't generating open looks. And when James Harden is actually sitting, the ball is moving around the perimeter pretty significantly all across the court. Norman Powell got a bunch of open shots late in this 4th quarter that pushed Memphis to nearly end up losing the game. And then in the final 2 minutes, James Harden checks back in. Now, I'll give him credit. He did hit a corner 3 to tie the game early into those 2 minutes, but he also airballed a 3 very late. And again, the momentum immediately shifted towards Memphis as soon as he got in the game. So as of right now, the problem is that James Harden is making things stagnant. Now, I will give James this bit of a break here. This is also not entirely his fault. It's something more so related to just the Clippers not understanding how to succeed with this play style. Now, I do believe that James Harden has lost quite a bit of a step and he does not get separation for his own offense nearly as much as he used to, and as a result, that also makes his playmaking not as good because scoring and playmaking have a symbiotic relationship, and if you're worse at one, you're likely to be worse at another. As a result, James is not quite the orchestrator that he used to be, and the system in which he is that system, the orchestrator, well, the players on this team, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Russell Westbrook, Zubac, Norman Powell, they're not really used to playing with this type of guy. Looking at basically all of the careers of all of the players on this team, they haven't really played with someone who had that heliocentric of a game. The best comparison would be Paul George with Russell Westbrook, and Paul George is probably probably the one who seems the least affected by James Harden's presence, I would say. So that makes more sense than anything else. They don't click. They don't connect. It's not that this group of players cannot work together, but they don't know how to work together right now. Now, that's something that can definitely be figured out to some degree through the course of the season, but it's also not ideal to be starting on such a significant back foot. They already have a losing record at this point, and I feel like it's going to take them a while to put together a good product here. They might end up fighting for a playoff seed as the year goes along if they're truly just going to be this bad together. So that is a big issue. The other big issue is that him and Russell Westbrook just straight up does not work. Now, a big reason why I do believe that that team without Harden was so good was that instead of James Harden, Norman Powell was out there. And that's not because Norman Powell is better than James Harden. That's because Norman Powell fits significantly better in a backcourt with Russell Westbrook than James Harden does. And this can go both ways. If the lineup is James Harden and Norman Powell and then everybody else, that makes way more sense. Russ and Harden's skill sets are redundant. Now, I understand that people said that about the Houston Rockets, and they ended up still being pretty good, albeit losing pretty badly to the Lakers in round 2. But still, a team that was pretty successful. However, James Harden and Russell Westbrook are not those players anymore. Neither of them are nearly as good as they were in the bubble. So as a result, this washed version, or if you want to be nice, half-washed version of what that duo was, it does not work in this context, especially when instead of like Robert Covington and PJ Tucker, it's Kawhi Leonard and Paul George who need shots in their own right. I understand why a lot of people thought that it could still work because they had that previous connection, but it's not the same thing. It's a different context and it's different players. Another big thing is that they are not a very big team, and Zubats has his way of just being a problem sometimes, and they need to go small, but when they went small in the past, they technically still had a lot of big wings out there, but now going small, I remember they ran a lineup that was Russ, Harden, Powell, Paul George, and I think PJ Tucker. And PJ Tucker playing center, dude should be in a retirement home right now, let alone playing center in 2023, almost 2024. It's just a bad idea. It just is. So they don't have the size with the wings. They gave all of that up in this Harden trade. And that was something that I think was an underrated factor for the Clippers, is if there's any position you want to have an overabundance of, it is tall, lengthy, strong wings that can hit threes and play defense. And they traded like 3.5 of those. KJ Martin, his three ball is not always the most significant, but he can play defense and he's a big forward. Marcus Morris can play defense, is a big forward and can shoot. Nicholas Batum is a big forward who can shoot and play defense. Robert Covington is a big forward that can shoot and play defense. You got rid of all of that, and instead you have James Harden, who's an offensive player who is stagnating your offense. So no shit, they're going to be worse if you got a significant defensive downgrade because you do not have that defensive depth, you do not have any size like you used to, and on offense, you're not even getting the positive of James Harden. The thing to talk about here is what exactly does this team look like if it does turn it around? Is that something that we think will happen? Well, I do have a lot of concerns, and I think ultimately it's going to have to come down to someone's ego is going to have to suffer a little bit here. And frankly, given that you traded so much for James Harden, and given that in general James Harden, at least in theory, should be better than Russell Westbrook currently is, Russell Westbrook needs to go to the bench. Norman Powell next to James Harden makes way more sense. That needs to be your closing lineup. You need a spot-up shooter out there. You do not need someone else out there who's going to dribble the ball. You have Paul George, who can be a great secondary ball handler, Kawhi Leonard, who can ball handle. You've got an overabundance of that when you need another guy who's just simply going to space the floor. And this isn't Russell Westbrook's fault. You know, Russell Westbrook's not really doing anything wrong. He just is the wrong choice. It's not about how good Russell Westbrook is. It's about what skill set Russell Westbrook has. And it is a redundant skill set next to this version of James Harden, with it being this version of Russell Westbrook, with them playing with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. They need to make that change. That's the first thing, and I think the most obvious thing. They looked so much better when it was one of those two, of Harden and Russ and Norman Powell. The other players on this team need to figure out how to work alongside James Harden being as ball dominant as he is. Now, maybe you can argue you just simply don't want James Harden to be this ball dominant in 2024, but you traded for him to be that. That's what they did. They wanted that lead playmaker. That's why they believed this was a good idea. So Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, Zubac has been pretty all right because big men just work with James Harden. But for the most part, this team doesn't really seem to get it. A lot of the times they just sit there and watch James Harden dribble. Part of this is also that they haven't had a training camp together, and that's a huge factor, and that's why we can't ultimately just write them off from here. But the signs are very, very bad. And if this team ended up just being a complete disaster, would not surprise me. It just would not. Man, gotta think about what James Harden's legacy looks like after that happens. If he goes to the Clippers, immediately makes them worse, because they started the season decent. They looked pretty all right. After everything else, basically everything post Houston has just been a fucking disaster for Harden. And man, I don't know what it says about his career, but it's not good. That's for sure. Anyways, shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and goodbye.